Today's question I'm going to ask about paternal narcissism, specifically in the case where it's a father-son relationship. And a narcissistic father and a son, when I answer this question in this video by looking at the 7 signs of a narcissistic father. Even though I'm talking here about the father-son relationship, some of these would apply to other child-parent relationships. Narcissism is a personality construct. Has certain characteristics like a sense of self-entitlement, self-centeredness, and has certain types. So let's take a quick overlook. It is a personality type with that sense of entitlement and self-centeredness. Grandiose, vulnerable types. Grandiose narcissism has arrogance, social dominance in it. It's really, usually people are really confident and critical, overt narcissists. The other type is vulnerable, and they're called covert. They usually carry a lot of shame, hypersensitive to criticism. What we see here is higher levels of narcissism, especially in my father-son relationship, really associated with poor parenting. Narcissistic fathers don't usually do a good job. It's not proficient in most of the ways, good and proficient the way we think about them. We specifically talk about father-son relationships and counseling at the same time. Psychologists, psychoanalytical work, and psychodynamic work. And those areas have a lot of research in them about this topic. A lot of things that come up are the ideas of the Oedipus complex, that the son is jealous of the father's relationship with the mother. And Sigmund Freud would talk about this, and a lot of theories support this idea that largely died out in the Oedipus complex that doesn't require the mention that the father would be narcissistic. That would be normal, as a normal son-father relationship. And you could see the resolution, potentially a failure to resolve it in the Oedipus complex. So the dynamics of narcissism really change quite a bit depending on how many children and how many sons and how many daughters there are. Just as you'd see in a daughter-father relationship, narcissistic fathers can be thought of in fearful ways. I mentioned the grandiose versus the deceitful smallness. It's a meshed and distant approach. It can manifest in a relationship. Somebody's over-involved with somebody else, over-involved with the son, for example, or quite distant. Here I'm going to be looking at a meshed side of an over-involved father-son. So here I coined the term narcissistic father and the sign of the kangaroo and something similar you're going to do. So there's a lot of repetition of the word narcissistic. For better or for worse, the father is going to be a huge influence on the son's life. And I'm not talking about grandiose in a specific situation. Father is usually a critical figure, discussed and talked about in many legends and stories, typical, regular. Certain issues pop up, like the values of a father or a grandfather is certainly not that clear. There's a lot of admiration usually in the mind of the son for the strength and the greatness of the father. And there's a desire to live up to the father's expectations. So you should keep that in mind in the mind of the pyramid casting. So if a son of a narcissist father is in his 20s or 30s, again, he's going to have a better chance of kind of idealize his father. When the son is older, that might change quite a little bit when he realizes the true nature of narcissism. Sign number 2 is a narcissistic father who's teaching the son a lot of maladaptive behaviors about how to approach different people in society. One of the areas that really stands out here is the father's advice to the son, not the relationships with women. The father might say something like, women will hurt you, don't trust women, don't let women tell you what you should be doing, or the man is the head of the household, the head of the church, and a lot of maladaptive, dysfunctional advice about relationships with women. He has a lot of bad advice about relationships with other men. Men are just trying to steal your partner or your wife. And he might teach me to be aggressive towards other men that are certainly not against them, overreacting too strongly with anger, and that's pretty common with grandiose narcissism. Basically, the father teaches the son to escalate confrontations, to take confrontation at one level and move it to a more dangerous level. Sign number 3 is that the father has a strong position on whether the son should have children of his own, right? So this is pretty interesting because this is not really directional. The position isn't always in one direction. It's just a strong position. So we see here what is a critical practice. We see strong opinions on both sides, having a lot of children or not to have any children. So some fathers say to a son, you should avoid women, avoid marriage, avoid children. That helps you protect your financial assets. And in terms of sexual activity, just go on dates and have sex that way. Have fun, don't commit. So really consistently give advice type 2. On the other side, there's the father who desperately wants the son to find a mate and potentially get married and have children. Because for the father, having a son means and meets a narcissistic mean as well. A narcissistic father should carry on the legacy of a great leader in this family. Again, that's a strong position one way or another about having children and having a sign number 4. And the sign number 4 is by far the longest one, requires the longest explanation. And the sign is at the father lives vicariously through the son. And we see this in father-daughter relationships too. This has a stronger effect that exists for the father-son relationship. A lot of this has to do with a grandiose fantasy component. So if we look at an extreme manifestation of narcissism, we see narcissistic personality disorders all over the place. Crosser B, order, BDSM, a lot of symptom criteria that are 9. And a lot of them involve having a really exaggerated fantasy of power, success, wealth, and the ideal love. Alpha. Not a symptom criterion. A lot of people are troubled with their own tentative mind. On this particular symptom, if they have it, it bears no mind to what happens in a problematic society. Some really say this is a kind of a fantasy. Ambitiously, they say so. And this can be destructive, and we see Buddha examples in this father-son relationship. So we look at the symptom criteria, and one of the things that we don't necessarily think that it's problematic, because it doesn't directly seem to affect people in a bad way, being arrogant, being jealous, or having a sense of entitlement, and a really funky smell. And what we really see with this is a symptom, symptom. People, relevance is taking persistent steps towards their goals, and that's what's going to happen to them in the future in case of a narcissistic father manifesting in their life. He'll be wealthy, he will find a perfect mate, he will find his true destiny, and that's the future orientation to these fantasies. And what is not mentioned here, this is also a past stamp fantasy, and it's what intersects with the father-son relationship. Here I'm going to give 3 examples, and I'm going to walk through them a little bit to illustrate this point well. The wishing well, not talk about the father-son relationship necessarily. So the father wasn't in high school, university then, probably given poor grades in some classes, and he had fantasies about the teachers, fantasies about going back in time, setting things right. And this recreation is not about succeeding necessarily, or failing. It's not about getting an A, or a B, or a C, where you might be getting an F, because narcissists don't usually believe that they're actually failing. Teachers understand that there are some failures, and they're not narcissist, low-grade nobodies. The teachers lie in a way that they don't want to believe it and believe in it. They want to give themselves a pat on the back and say, I am hallelujah. That's about me. That's narcissist sitting in their classroom, but still failing to miss one of the greatest lessons of all times, encountering their own ego and destroying it right now. So the narcissistic fantasy is going back in time and encountering these people in the present moment, telling them how they're losers, bullying them, telling them how they failed. Narcissists show all of y'all how to resist the father-son moment. And other examples, and the next example is father being bullied as a child, and no one stood up for him. He was unable to fight back for himself. So the father has legitimate complaints here. He knows that bullying is quite damaging and contributes to narcissistic behaviors. But either way, the fantasy involves revenge on the boys, but also knowing that the bullies were also losers themselves, and that sounds like the teacher-student relationship, and that turns out to be great at some point. Wonderful. The last example using here is cocaine. The narcissist marijuana, rejecting tobacco, or a female love interest. And the fantasy for crack goes on and on and on. He goes back in time and has a moment with himself, watching Back to the Future, and loving whatever he's looking for. And that's to show him how foolish he is, to miss the greatness of the narcissist, and really kind of make fun of himself, waiting for opportunities all day long to be with amazing people, longing for real relationships. Fantasies go deeply into the past, and they're not just about changing the past, but adding information to it, to every situation in the past, present, and future, and telling something about yourself, mostly around the greatness of narcissists. So it's not about having great grades at school. It's about having the school of life opportunity and fathering yourself. The fantasy, of course, is about seeing yourself on camera and seeing your own son succeed, but not as much as he would, because he's always a narcissist, better, more advanced, elder, living vicariously through the son, but not actually, because he's always great, wonderful, accusing everyone of deeds, sins. You have to pay for your narcissistic behavior. The boys, they're always the same, going through the teachers, the boys, and timeless behavior is not tolerated by society, because sons are great. And the sun, the shining, big, celestial body, it's also great, wonderful, and the skies are blue. Stop the bullying and be a mermaid. Talk about elves and fairies, and wash dishes with this dish soap called Fairy that's commonly sold in Russia. So that's to the bully boy. Father encouraging the son to fight back physically and going through the system and reporting the violations to the police. Typical fantasy of an urban boy, not being able to do what his father wants him to do. And the father being rejected by a love interest. That can go two different ways. I've seen it go two different ways. Sometimes the father says, don't worry about her, you can do better. Simplistic answer. But sometimes the father teaches the son to pursue that love interest. The one that doesn't really want the son. That's more of an effort to rewrite the father's experience with a different outcome. Okay?